Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because we're doing something absolutely wild. We're going to take a rapid-fire, highly structured journey through the entire history of the world based on our source material. We're going to track the massive, undeniable cause and effect chain of human progress, brutal conflicts, and just absolutely game-changing ideas. So, buckle up, let's dive right into this.
Right off the bat, this is the ultimate question our source text poses. I mean, how do we actually draw a straight line from the absolute beginning of human evolution all the way to the brink of modern global warfare? Think of it like a giant chaotic domino effect. You've got empires rising, brilliant inventions spreading like wildfire, and totally different civilizations colliding. To really wrap our heads around this massive chain reaction, we've got to go all the way back to the very first domino.
Section 1. The Dawn of Civilization.
Our journey kicks off in modern-day Iraq, where the ancient Sumerians were fundamentally changing the game. They weren't just building these massive pyramid-shaped towers. They actually invented writing, and get this, the 60-second minute. But, with early civilization comes the absolute thirst for control. When someone suggested ruling for the benefit of the people, King Sargon basically scoffed. He flat out declared that kings rule for their own pride, power, and possessions. And with that charming philosophy, he conquered the independent cities around him and built the literal first empire. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was waking up too. The Egyptians were busy building their iconic pyramids, the Minoans were making incredible art, and over in the Indus River Valley, highly organized cities were popping up with perfectly straight roads and a language we still haven't decoded today.
Then, for some mysterious reason, almost all these early Bronze Age empires started collapsing at the exact same time, which ushered in the Iron Age. Amidst all this chaos, Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and another group, the Phoenicians, were super busy building ships and coastal cities. But here's the coolest part. The Canaanites were actually using an alphabet over 3,500 years ago. The proof? It's an inscription found on an ancient lice comb. Literally, a lice comb. It was such a brilliantly simple idea that the Greeks came along and entirely copied it to make their own alphabet.
Moving right along to Section 2, Empires, Philosophies, and Faiths.
While ancient empires were busy cyclically conquering one another, an entirely different kind of revolution was happening around the globe. It was a revolution of ideas. Over in the East, thinkers like Siddhartha Gautama, Confucius, and Laozi were sparking these massive intellectual movements. And in the West, the Greeks were busy inventing democracy and holding the very first Olympics. But they also managed to severely anger the Persians, which led to some truly legendary clashes. Despite all the warfare, Greek intellectual output was just absolutely unmatched. It followed this incredible direct lineage of thought. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great. Alexander then took all that supreme Greek confidence, decided to get revenge on the Persians, and just relentlessly conquered the known world before dying shortly after deciding, naturally, that he was a god. So, Alexander's sudden death leaves this massive power vacuum, which brings us to a really tricky question. Who should rule the world now? Well, the answer was basically just total chaos. His generals fiercely fought each other and carved up the empire. Now, during this Hellenistic period, a Greek thinker in Egypt amazingly figured out how to use shadows to measure the circumference of the earth. Incredible, right? But not all leaders at the time were quite that bright. Take King Antiochus. He disastrously tried to force the Jewish people to worship him as Zeus, and famously threatened them with a ham sandwich if they refused. Obviously, the Jews said, yeah, no thanks, and successfully fought to reclaim their own nation.
All right, Section 3, Rome and the Middle Ages.
As Greek influence started to fade out, new heavyweights were stepping into the ring. The Parthians took over the east, but in the west, the Romans were expanding relentlessly. They eventually defeated Carthage and Hannibal's literally terrifying war elephants. This totally set the stage for a massive empire. You've got leaders like Julius Caesar conquering vast amounts of land, and fun fact, giving us a slightly flawed leap year calendar, before Augustus steps up as the Rome's first true emperor. But then, a man named Jesus was crucified by the Romans. According to his followers, he rose from the dead, which sparked a massive grassroots movement. A guy named Paul went from actively hunting Christians to spreading their religion absolutely everywhere. The Romans tried to stamp it out by brutally feeding Christians to lions, but ironically, this just made the faith even more popular. Ultimately, Emperor Constantine took over, accepted Christianity himself, and got everyone to agree on a unified set of beliefs. Eventually, the western half of the Roman Empire fell to Germanic tribes like the Vandals, while the Byzantine half managed to hold on. But a massive shift was brewing in the Middle East. Arab clans had been fighting each other for centuries, right? But then a man named Muhammad united these warring factions under the brand new religion of Islam. And because they were suddenly no longer allowed to fight each other, they rapidly expanded outward. They fought everyone else instead, quickly building an empire that was larger than anything the world had ever seen before. Which brings us to Section 4, Asian dynasties and trade routes.
While Europe and the Middle East were clashing, some truly incredible migrations and expansions were happening over in Asia. Epic maritime journeys were taking Austroasiatic and Austronesian peoples as far across the ocean as Madagascar and Hawaii. Meanwhile, mainland China was going through this dizzying, whiplash story of unification and division. They saw a rapid-fire succession of dynasties: Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Jin, and Tang. Sometimes it was one perfectly unified China, and other times it fractured into as many as 16 different Chinas at once. But throughout all this chaos, they managed to build massive defensive walls and brought world-changing inventions to life, like paper and printing.
Now, looking at this era also highlights a highly relatable, kind of funny difference in ancient cultures: hygiene. The Chinese were actually the very first to invent and use toilet paper. Contrast that with the Romans, who were using shared sponges on sticks, or the Greeks, who used broken pieces of clay pots. Ouch. The Indians, meanwhile, utilized water. And speaking of India, this era saw the region unified by the Maurya and Gupta empires, which ushered in a beautiful golden age. Indian teachers and traders spread Hinduism and Buddhism throughout Southeast Asia, while Buddhism also worked its way all the way up into China, Korea, and Japan.
Let's jump back over to Europe, where we see another massive explosion of movement, this time coming down from the north. The Vikings did not just stay in Scandinavia. They aggressively expanded. They settled in Russia, England, Normandy, Iceland, and they humorously named a giant icy land Greenland in hopes that geopolitics would make it a hot destination later on, a real marketing spin. Some of them even made it all the way to North America. Meanwhile, further south, the Pope launched the Crusades, sending waves of Christians to fight holy wars against the rapidly expanding Seljuk Turks.
Section 5. Exploration and the Reformation. This chaotic new era begs a really good question. Wait, how on earth did the Mongols get all the way over here? Bursting out of Mongolia under Genghis Khan, they didn't just conquer a little bit of land. They conquered twice as much territory as Alexander the Great, and then they doubled it again. It was completely unprecedented. But their vast, highly connected empire had a truly catastrophic side effect. It very likely facilitated the rapid spread of the Black Death, which ended up wiping out at least a third of Europe's entire population. But emerging from the ashes of that horrific tragedy, Europe desperately needed a rebirth. And so the Renaissance began, heavily aided by a crucial new invention. That invention, of course, was the printing press with movable type. But this newfound power was utilized vastly differently depending on where you looked. In Germany, Gutenberg was mass-producing Bibles, spreading information. But down in Spain, during the brutal Inquisition, the authorities were way more focused on burning heretics and hunting down secret Jewish Catholics who refused to convert. This intense religious fervor was happening right as the age of exploration kicked into high gear. While the Portuguese were sailing all the way around Africa looking for a new route for spices, Columbus sailed west and entirely accidentally stumbled upon the Americas. The Portuguese quickly realized they could bypass the ancient Silk Road entirely. But their new maritime dominance led to a tragically brutal economic cycle. They traded manufactured goods in Africa for enslaved people, traded those slaves for food, traded the food back in Europe for more goods, and just rinsed and repeated this horrific loop. At this exact same time, religion was totally fracturing Europe. Martin Luther used that printing press we talked about to spark the Protestant Reformation. And, over in England, King Henry VIII literally created an entirely new church and made England Protestant just so he could get a divorce and try to produce a male heir. Talk about a domino effect.
Section 6. Revolutions and Global Imperialism. Fueling the rapid rise of northwestern Europe, religious disputes essentially drove these nations to race for global dominance. The Dutch captured the spice trade, while English pirates effectively repelled the Spanish. This frantic race to colonize the Americas inevitably led to a massive clash between France and Britain, which is often called World War II. Britain won, but both nations were left absolutely drowning in war debt. And both arrived at terrible solutions. Britain decided to tax the Americans to pay off the debt. The result? The American Revolution. France watched this happen, fought against Britain, won, but also went into crippling debt. Their solution? Tax their own people. The result? The French Revolution. This kicked off an unstoppable chain reaction, inspiring leaders like Simon Bolivar to launch revolutions across Latin America, while the British decided to pivot entirely to an industrial revolution powered by steam. To sell all the goods they were suddenly manufacturing, Britain built a second, truly massive global empire. The British East India Company essentially took over all of India and aggressively pushed opium into China. When China naturally pushed back, the British Navy simply flexed its muscle and took Hong Kong. Around this exact same time in China, a man exposed to Christian missionaries had a fever dream, convinced himself he was literally the brother of Jesus Christ, and started the Taiping Rebellion. The death toll from this was absolutely staggering, leaving as many as 30 million people dead. Just let that number sink in.
Meanwhile, back in Europe, Italy and Germany had finally united and decided, hey, they wanted colonies too. This sparked the aggressive scramble for Africa orchestrated by Bismarck. To justify slicing up a continent, imperialists twisted Charles Darwin's evolutionary theories into social Darwinism, basically claiming Europeans were simply the fittest to survive and rule over everyone else. But there was a brilliant, highly logical pushback against this arrogant mindset at the time. It asked, if your brain evolved for survival, how can you trust it for truth?
To make matters worse, the European powers had established rules saying you couldn't claim land that was already claimed, yet they completely ignored the very obvious fact that Africans already occupied the continent. Long before the Europeans arrived to casually slice up the map in a boardroom, Africa was home to massive, highly established empires: Egypt, Kush, Aksum, Ethiopia, Numidia, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Benin, and the Zulus, just to name a few. But the imperial race ignored all of this. The European powers brutally invaded, butchered, and colonized anyway, ultimately making Britain the biggest empire in human history.
And that brings us to the ultimate, incredibly tense climax of this whole explainer. Think about it. All of these great powers are expanding simultaneously. But the map is only so big. Aside from the slowly crumbling Ottoman Empire, there is literally nowhere left to expand. And critically, everyone is suddenly inventing terrifying new technologies: telegraphs, airplanes, heavily armored battleships, and submarines. So what happens when massive, heavily armed empires run completely out of room on the globe and finally collide? Well, that is the spark that ignites the world wars. Thank you so much for joining me on this wild, rapid journey through our history. Keep questioning everything, and I will see you on the next explainer.